Being a CISO is like waging a never-ending chess game against players you don't know, can't see, and attack without warning. On this podcast, cybersecurity experts have a pragmatic dialogue on cyber risk, current attacks, and security trends. Welcome to the CISO's Gambit.
I'm fortunate to be joined by Francis Ofungwu, the Global Field CISO at GitLab, where he leads the organization's software security field practice. Francis is currently focused on helping organizations implement a prescriptive security architecture for DevSecOps. Francis has over 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity and compliance management, and his expertise includes strategic planning, leading cross-functional teams, application security program development, digital privacy, and incident management. Prior to joining GitLab, Francis led the design and execution of global cybersecurity programs across several large organizations in various industries, and he has served in multiple roles where he has been accountable for the management, engineering, and operations for cybersecurity programs across the globe. Francis, welcome to the CISO's Gambit.
Thank you very much, Sean. Pleasure to be here.
Francis, for the audience that is maybe not as familiar with GitLab, could you give us an overview of what it is that you do there, and specifically the area of focus as it relates to information security and risk management?
Absolutely. So it's interesting, right? It's been, believe it or not, over 15 years since this whole DevOps movement entered the conversation. And since that time, a lot of organizations have been trying to unify those silo technology practices of dev and ops, and security entered into the conversation. And then we started with DevSecOps to try and harmonize those 3 functions. And then there have been several permutations of that story over the last few years, whether it's platform engineering or rugged DevOps. We keep talking about the same thing, which is how do we get standardization and consistency and unify the delivery expectations of the business under one umbrella. And in that time, GitLab has really driven the path to unify those multiple silos on one platform. So whatever you're doing from a velocity standpoint, and no matter the amount of tools that you have within your organization, if you're able to have this forcing function of one platform for your developers, your security teams, and your operations teams to use, it helps with that collaboration and helps with that standardization that we're missing in the industry today. Funny side note, I was talking to a friend of mine, and they're going through this process of trying to pare down the 45 tools that they have in their DevOps ecosystem today. That's a lot of tools, and that creates overhead, and that creates silos, and that creates a lot of things to manage. So at GitLab, we're moving past just the version control part of Git to look at every stage of the development lifecycle and give you one platform and one application to use to manage your SDLC. And then the second part of your question, which is what do I do at GitLab? So as Field CISO.
What is it you do?
Yeah, exactly. What do I do? As Field CISO, I'm working as an advisory to our customers to help them understand the security value of this way of working. Because as I mentioned, a lot of these teams are still working in silos, and security teams require some envisioning or some level of strategy to see how they can adopt this new way of executing on this in a DevOps or DevSecOps world. So I'm working directly with our customers to help them with that strategy and make sure they understand the value that GitLab brings to the table.
That's an incredibly important piece, because CISOs of my background may not necessarily have the experience nor training to really navigate the waters associated with implementing something like a full-blown secure software development lifecycle process, and never mind the implementation and tooling, et cetera. It's been an area that I didn't lean into, having come from the infrastructure side. What specifically brought you to this area of focus, specifically in secure software development and the enormity of that problem?
So I worked about 15 years ago at a company called Rackspace, and that was a company that was in the forefront of everything cloud. And 15 years ago, we had to demonstrate trust to our customers that we could essentially secure their data or have governance over the workloads that we're bringing to the cloud. And part of that role required answering a lot of questions about what we were doing to improve or at least be on par with the security posture those organizations required. So since that time, in the last 15 years, what is cloud security has evolved into AppSec or has evolved into DevSecOps. Again, no matter the terms don't really matter. It's really how do you drive trust in a digital first or software first world. And I've always been interested in that topic, and I've always been interested in that domain. And my roles since Rackspace, whether it's the time I led a DevSecOps and cloud security practice at Protiviti, or the work that I'm doing now, has always revolved around this space. So it's become sort of my natural domain of expertise.
What have you observed in your time, both as a practitioner and advisor? I remember when you and I first met each other, and you were advising some of the world's largest companies at the time. You and I were both at Optiv. And I remember some of our early conversations, which were more about our experiences being out there speaking to pretty diverse executives. What have you found that's different?
Yeah.
Or maybe you haven't. That's different about this type of conversation as opposed to some of the other more traditional speeds and feeds, network infrastructure centric security discussions?
The key part that I'll call out as a different perspective or different approach in this area is the lack of control. And let me expand on that. So if you look at traditional security domains, whether it's network security, identity, you have CISOs or the security executive with control over that area. So they have some level of influence to drive improvements in this area. It's not always cut and dry, but they have a lot of influence. Software security is one area where we're wholly reliant on the actions of a completely different part of the organization, whether it's your development, your engineering, and you don't always have full visibility or governance over their day-to-day actions. So job number one, or even job number zero in that perspective, is how do you influence other people to execute your strategy when you don't have full governance or administrative control over the work they're doing? And it stops becoming sort of a technical discussion and starts becoming how do you influence people to do your bidding, for lack of a better term.
This has always been a challenge in
Right.
cyber as a whole. The mother may I model that is driven by the necessity for segregation of duties and all of the good things that we've been trained as cybersecurity pros. What are the things that you've observed that are really difficult for some organizations that are saying, hey, we have a mandate for whatever reason to implement true secure development processes?
Yeah.
I certainly struggled with it. What do you see?
Part of it is we are not, and I say we from a security standpoint, is that we're not always versed in the workflow and day-to-day tasks an engineering or developer team have to do to deliver to the velocity of the business. So what happens is that we take our traditional, sometimes fairly waterfall approach of, we just did this vulnerability scan, we just did this pen test, we just did this risk assessment, and here are the things that you have to go fix. Good luck. Let us know when they're done. The timer starts now. Unfortunately, that approach does not work in a modern product-led or engineering-led organization, because the speed of change and the rate of continuous improvement doesn't really fit into that one-stop view of your security posture and a task list of things that you have to go pay down. So where we have to shift is to meet the engineering organization in terms of where they are, how they work. How do we get to be security engineers and have a stakeholder to stakeholder conversation about our security expectations in a language that the developers and engineers can understand?
So it's not too dissimilar when it comes to other aspects of interfacing with business stakeholders. When a security leader is saying, hey, we're going to undertake this effort, Francis, can you help me and advise me where I should look at refactoring skills and tooling? What are the things that you find yourself gravitating towards in terms of this is where you start?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll tell you what we hear. So again, I'm fortunate enough to be in this advisory role where I'm speaking to a lot of security executives about the strategic challenges that they're faced today in this space. And there are four key areas that we hear a lot, or we hear from CISOs that they're struggling with. The first one is a problem near and dear to my heart: open source inventory management. The way we build applications today and the way we build code today is not like what we did years ago, where we were very intentional in acquisition of the supply chain or the software that we use to build code. A lot of it is from Google, Stack Overflow, AI generated code. So you're cobbling together a lot of lines of code to develop your applications today. So that inventory and of the tools that you're using, especially from an open source standpoint, is something that our security executives are fairly hot on in terms of trying to get their heads
Yeah.
around. So that's number one. Number two is that governance visibility. So how do I get my arms or my eyes on exactly where we start and where we end, meaning the planning to production path? How do I get more visibility into the risks that exist throughout that life cycle? And it's not just your typical vulnerabilities, it's how your developers are authenticating to the platforms they're using, how data is flowing from one build part of your environment to the release part of your environment, how you're orchestrating security controls throughout the SDLC. This governance visibility piece is something that CISOs struggle with. And then the second and third point sort of are linked together. Because of that tool sprawl, you have this extended incident and vulnerability management lifecycle that CISOs are uncomfortable with. Because if there's another log4j, or if there's another 0 day, and trying to understand how you're impacted in your SDLC can be a challenge, because you have all these different tools and all these different places or projects and repos in your environments that are hard to get your arms around. So you have this extended incident management lifecycle if you can't really triage and contain the incidents in a timely manner. And as I mentioned, the fourth piece is linked to that. That lack of end-to-end visibility can also lead to extended regulation and compliance life cycles, because again, you don't know where to start and when to finish, because you have this sprawl of technologies and tools that hamper your velocity when it comes to meeting whatever specific standard that you're driving towards. So those four areas are what we hear our CISOs tell us they're challenged with. So back to your question around, what do you go double click on? What do you refactor on? Those four areas are typically where I would recommend people start looking into.
You mentioned the difficulties around, for lack of a better term, effectively software bill of materials, but in the context of open source. And you mentioned log4j. And I remember the dialogue between other execs saying, how could this have happened? And it brings me back to, you do realize you're using free code, right?
Right.
That this is community sourced code.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me. And certainly the open source movement has been one of the most important things that technology, I think, has enabled. I mean, some of my favorite things would not exist without things like Linux and OpenGL, et cetera, et cetera. However, do you find that these conversations around something like, hey, are the libraries I'm utilizing for this particular product, are you finding that teams themselves are double clicking and tearing them apart to better understand weaknesses in there? Or is it still a trust it because everyone seems to think it's trustworthy and we'll just roll with it?
Yeah. So let me start off by saying that open source, I don't think it's going nowhere anytime soon. In fact, we should embrace it as a way of making our teams better at what they do, or even faster at what they do. The last survey that I saw, it said 96% of public-facing applications have some open source component to them. So it's here to stay. So let's embrace it and figure out how we manage the sprawl. But to your question, I think where we get ourselves in trouble is by just saying, well, it's here to stay. Let's just hope for the best. let's not analyze really what we're using, how it's being maintained, when last was it updated, and really getting a sense of the real estate of our open source dependencies. Because knowing what you have is the first step towards addressing what challenges you may have to address in the near term and long term. But a lot of our teams, a lot of our sort of development practices today don't really have that full view of every component, every dependency that is open source. And if they don't have that view, then how can they start to mature in that space? So our use of open source has to be intentional, for lack of a better description. It has to be something that we know exactly what's coming into our development lifecycle, and we know exactly when things need to be cycled out of that development lifecycle. It helps us get better in this space. And the next part of this effort is, once you have a sense of what you're using, you can start asking questions. Why? Why are we using this specific package that has not been maintained or had any updates to it since 2015? Why are we using this specific package that no one else is using and seems to have a very low score in the open source community? So those are the steps towards maturity in this space, but it really starts with identifying exactly what you are using and getting that full real estate of your open source dependencies.
There's been famously some high vulnerabilities in traditional networking equipment, VPN concentrators and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, it ends up being a software defect. A couple of them that were just released by CISA with some heavy guidance about whether this technology, in this case it was VPN-based technology, should be used or not anymore, was pretty clear. Going back to what you're saying, is some of those vulnerabilities came from legacy packages that perhaps didn't have that level of rigor when it was implemented into the base product. This is a really serious problem that I don't believe we as an industry have done a great job of getting ahead of.
Yeah, so let's start off with acknowledging it's a hard problem to solve. There are no easy or quick or easy buttons to address the challenge in this area, because essentially what you're trying to achieve is software assurance. And software assurance is a complicated problem, because not only do you have to find your risk, threat model, address the controls, make sure the controls are effective, and so on, but you then have to demonstrate to your customers or your end users through some type of validation exercise that we've gone through these processes. So software assurance, by definition, is a hard problem to solve. So I don't want to paint a picture that this is something you can knock out in 6 weeks. It's got to be infused into your day-to-day practices. That said, I personally don't believe it matters which standard you use, whether it's the NIST SSDF, ISO 27004, OWASP, SAM, the CISO Secure by Design white paper. They all are pointing towards the same direction, which is, here are the domains that you have to think about if you're going to improve in this area. So just pick one, right? There are some that you may have to follow because of the business that you're in or your industry affiliations, but all of them essentially overlap in terms of their requirements. So now that you've picked one, you're essentially trying to use that framework to communicate to the rest of the organization. And I like this term around the intent of the control, not the control itself. I think what we see in the industry a lot is, oh, we have to do XYZ for PCI. We got to do XYZ for ISO. And that doesn't translate over the fence when we're talking to security engineers. So let's peel the layers back and understand the intent of the control and communicate the intent of the control in the context of our business. So again, just to recap, pick a standard, understand what it means to your organization, and then communicate to the organization the intent of what we're trying to solve for. Because what you will learn from that exercise is your engineering teams will be more willing to engage in terms of your perspective on the intent of the control and give you some feedback as to why that control is not effective for their SDLC, or why that specific type of threat is not exploitable given how you deployed your application, it helps you engage in a meaningful conversation versus just throwing controls and standards over the fence for people to follow. And in terms of how we gain traction or how we do better in this space, we have to evolve beyond our scanning and patching mentality. And what I mean by that is, because of the lack of definition, the lack of structure in this space, we're very reliant on tools that scan and tell us there's a critical, there's a high, go fix it. What that creates is a culture or a way of work where everything is a critical and high because these tools haven't been tuned for our environments. So if we just keep shipping tons of critical and highs to our developers to fix, again, we're not really addressing risk. We're basically saying everything is the same, and we're not addressing risk in a meaningful manner. So to be clear, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but it shouldn't be the end all and be all of our security practices. It should be something that is a good data point for us to use, but let's make sure we're understanding the complete SDLC from plan to production and not just relying on those security scanning tools to give us that view.
That's an excellent point and a significant problem. I remember when we were developing the version 4 of the Cloud Controls Matrix, one of the biggest pieces of feedback we had received was, great, but what does it mean for me?
Right.
In other words, sure, I'm going to align to this, but it hasn't been built to suit, I guess is probably a best way to describe that. And this problem that you've identified about everything is high, everything is critical, brings me to one area I've observed over years. I remember when I was CISO of a large insurance company here in California, where we were really struggling as a security team to make any kinds of inroads with our developers. First off, we had the issue of my team wasn't terribly well versed in development processes. They had just adopted an agile framework, and infrastructure people look at agile and go, that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't to them. But when it came down to it, the only middle ground that we found was through participation of creation of both user stories and non-functional requirements. What I don't know is whether or not that is even an approach that's taken anymore when it comes to developing modern day needs and requirements, other than doing what you said is going to be a failure, which is, here's the standard. Let me know when you're done implementing.
Yeah, so sort of threat modeling and security user stories, I feel, continues to be an effective way of influencing the security by design objectives as early on as possible in your development lifecycle. The realities are that that's great for greenfield applications or applications that are being sort of either refactored, but your maintenance or your legacy applications that have been around for a while, which, let's face it, make up a significant real estate of the things we have to secure today, don't always benefit from that planning stage activity that we get from threat modeling and security user stories. So we have to marry the security user stories and threat modeling with visibility, with monitoring for events of interest. If we see through our audit controls or our traces or metrics that, well, there are a lot of developers that approve their own changes. There are a lot of things that go through the development lifecycle without actually remediating.
What do you mean, developers approving their own change? That never happens.
Yeah, right. So it's one of those things where we have to come back to the development teams with the realities of what they're doing that impact our security posture, as opposed to coming up with these hypotheticals from a user story standpoint or a threat modeling standpoint. They will listen to those threat models, but nothing drives your point home better than the realities of what's going on. So if you're able to couple your user stories with evidence of what you're seeing when you capture these events of interest from either your source code manager or your CI/CD tools, being able to have a meaningful conversation to say, here are the things that we're concerned about. Here are the things that are happening. Can we implement controls to prevent them from happening or detect when they do happen?
With your extensive background in leadership across GSIs, I'm curious, and I believe you were primarily on the advisory side, so not necessarily audit, but
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had to wear that hat before as well. How have you found that the technical audit profession has adapted and how they've been able to make meaningful observations into things like a secure software development program? Have you found that they have, and I'm speaking very broadly
Sure.
here as technical auditors
Yeah.
as a whole, have you found that they have kept pace with it? Or is it an area where they might be lagging?
I would say that it's an area that is nascent in its maturity. I love our friends in audits. We've dealt with a lot of difficult challenges over the years. And I'm not speaking about, audit as my specific organization, just in general over my 20-year career, is that they're a good ally in helping you position not only challenges in the organization, but also the positive things that you're doing to mitigate risk. One of the things that I've noticed in my current role is that when we talk to customers, there is a disconnect between what modern DevSecOps does and how audit teams assess the risk associated with those practices. Meaning the audit teams are asking for what I would call point-in-time snapshots of a specific control without the realization or the understanding that modern DevSecOps is just a continuous change of services and accounts and identities and practices. And it's hard to capture the maturity of your controls by asking for an evidence of policies that are followed or the last time a developer went through a training on secure development. So those concepts around auditing a technology organization have to change to meet the realities of modern DevSecOps or modern DevOps, which means that we need continuous assurance. We need to be able to feed into a mechanism. And really, I think it's a great opportunity because modern DevOps or modern DevSecOps is rich with data. There's so many services and practices and tools that are rich in providing us with information about what's going on. Audits should embrace this sort of data rich environment to give them the visibility around what's going on a continuous assurance basis and not a point in time audit basis.
Something adjacent to this is obviously compliance, which is something that drives a lot of security programs for better or for worse. From your point of view, what you've observed with the adoption of generative AI technologies in particular, in the context of development, what kinds of conversations have come up around code reuse, code viability, and ultimately the resultant outcome, which may be better, may be worse from a development and integrity standpoint of code? Have you seen anything that makes you go, this could be really huge towards getting well from a secure development standpoint, or this is simply a completely new vector that we may or may not be ready for?
Yeah. So that essentially, the question you just asked is essentially a huge part of the conversations I'm having today in this space, right? Because for the last 2 years, really, this concept of generative AI and code generation is a topic near and dear to a lot of CTOs, CIOs, and CISOs' hearts. So what I always explain to people interested in this space is if you look at the modern development lifecycle, code generation is not as significant a part of that development lifecycle as we think. I think there are a lot of folks that believe, oh, we just create code and we ship products. Like, no, there's just so much that goes on in terms of managing microservices and your build infrastructure and your CI/CD. And they're just downstream processes that have to scale up their capabilities if you're going to increase the throughput or the output of code that you're generating. So what could happen where if you're a CTO or a CIO thinking, well, we can develop faster with generative AI, is the reality is you're just going to create a bottleneck in the rest of your development lifecycle because those generative AI code line or lines of code still have to go through testing, still have to go to security scanning, still have to go through those downstream processes. So just thinking about generative AI in the concept of SDLC just for generating code is not the complete picture. Think of AI or think of your entire DevSecOps platform powered by AI. And that's how we think about it at GitLab is every function, again, and I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but every function from plan to release can be powered by AI to reduce the complexities for standardization, to increase efficiencies. So let's definitely use it for code generation, but let's think about the other bottlenecks that could be created as a result of that throughput of code. And again, empower the whole system with AI to reduce those complexities.
Let's say that we had met today for the first time, and I'm sharing with you some of my anxieties about approaching a meaningful, value-adding conversation with my development stakeholders and business partners who may not even want to give me the time of day because I would be out of my depth. What would you recommend to me or somebody else that might find themselves in that situation?
Value stream analysis. And what we mean by that is contextualizing your DevSecOps workflow. So you're looking again at how you get from idea to production, but all the different tools and services that get you there. And then you understand exactly what day-to-day operations look like for your developers and engineers. So you're starting from a place of being informed to what day-to-day operations look like for those developers. Once you have that visibility or understanding, the next step is trying to understand from a security context, could we unify tool sets or processes across that SDLC? And I mentioned earlier that I spoke to a friend of mine that told me they have 45 tools in their DevOps ecosystem specifically for security, not just the entire DevOps ecosystem, just specifically for security. This is a point of frustration that developers and engineering teams are dealing with today in a large scale organization, but also in small organizations where there are just too many things telling them what is a priority. So how do we consolidate that story? How do we tell a better story that is in line with the day-to-day operations of a developer to say, here are the things that we care about, here's the output that we care about, and here are some steps we're going to follow to consolidate the technologies and vendors that you have to rely on in this space. And then the third piece, as we start to think about what better collaboration looks like, is how do we drive automated governance via the pipeline? If the pipeline is the path to production, how do we create things like policy as code, privacy as code, compliance as code, instructions to the developer to meet them where they are? Not a big binder or a Confluence page of things they have to go read to be compliant. How do we instruct or instrument our pipelines to be secure by giving developers guardrails in their pipelines? So driving that automated governance via pipelines. And if we have a discussion that is thinking about these things in the context of pipelines and in the context of the development platform that engineers use, they're more receptive because, again, we're talking about things that they can do within their day-to-day operations. And last but not least, and we've talked about this already, let's start to gather data points. Let's take inventory of the open source software that we're using. Let's take inventory of those events of interest that I talked about. Let's gather some data points that allow us to be more direct and more specific around the events of interest that cause us concern that we want to see either preventative detection or response controls around.
You mentioned this concept of policy as code, and you wrote an article for Cyber Daily on the importance of this concept. For those that are not familiar, could you provide an overview of whether it's a philosophy and a process, and how do you define it?
Yeah, it's both, or if not more, right? It's basically, again, meeting developers where they are in terms of they work with code, they work with instrumentation across the entire development lifecycle. So how do we set the right expectations of what security and compliance objectives that we have in code form, in language that they're using from a day-to-day standpoint? So this is just providing them with those guardrails that say, after you've generated a line of code, or when you try to merge your code into the main branch or a feature branch, here are the next steps in terms of security controls that will be followed to give you faster feedback on what this specific merge request has created in terms of vulnerabilities. So that concept of using our current practices from a developer standpoint to give them that faster feedback on security vulnerabilities is a way of developing this security as code concept, because it's in line with their day-to-day operations. It's not something that they are waiting for the security team to give them a list of things to go patch a few hours before release. It's that faster feedback loop that is, again, making them more educated on what they're doing to introduce vulnerabilities to our code.
What would you suggest to somebody that wants to get into this area of expertise, but then would also want to aspire in the future to be a development savvy cybersecurity executive?
One of the things I genuinely believe is that this area that we're talking about today is going to be what cybersecurity is in the next 5 years, if it's not already. Because everything, as you know, is being powered by software, and everything is code, and everything is even infrastructure. This concept of infrastructure as code, everything we're doing needs some level of understanding of the software dependencies that we use to drive technology decisions today. So I firmly believe that having a firm understanding of software architecture will enable you to be a better cybersecurity executive today and in the near future. And the concept or the domain that I think embodies this way of thinking is security engineering. Security engineering can have a lot of definitions depending on who you speak to or which O'Reilly book you're using these days. But the concept is just understanding that nothing is secure out of the box, and you need to develop engineering practices to elevate the security of those tools and those services and that software to meet your business requirements, which means that you have to have some concept of how to take that idea and implement it as either code or through some kind of instrumentation that gets you there. So it's really going to be the future of security. And the more we're able to articulate our security objectives in the perspective of software, DevOps, Agile, whatever it is that your business is calling modern software development, that's how we advance, or that's how we get better traction with our business decisions in today and in the near future.
Thank you for joining us on the show today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Great conversation. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I always appreciate spending time with you, and I'm sure we'll see each other soon and have this conversation again over something stronger, coffee or otherwise.
You've been listening to the CISO's Gambit. I'm your host, Sean Crudero. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this show, please leave a comment and subscribe.
Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com.